Hello everyone, it's Dr. Sam Hurst, and this is the 9th in our series of the October Gothics a Day Tempts the Vampires to Stay. Particularly fitting today, you'll find. As usual, I'll be introducing a Gothic text, talking about why it's important, giving you some key plot points, and also giving you some reading recommendations. Lots and lots of them today. If you haven't already guessed what we're talking about, it is, of course, The Vampyre by John Polidori, an 1819 short story. Publication history of this is quite interesting because Polidori didn't have control over that first publication, and it was actually published as though written by Lord Byron, something which led to its early popularity but was popular with neither Lord Byron nor Polidori. There is a connection though between Lord Byron and the tale, because the writing of it of course stems back to that famous gathering at the Via Diodati, where Byron, Percy and Mary Shelley and Claire Clairmont were gathered with Byron's physician Polidori and had a ghost story competition, which led most famously to Frankenstein and second most famously to The Vampyre by Polidori. Now this wasn't his original tale, that apparently wasn't very good, but he built this tale on the sort of foundations that Byron created in a fragment of his own that is usually referred to as Augustus Deverell. Now, Byron didn't want to finish the story, and Polidori took it and made it into an anti-Byronic narrative. Now, why do I say anti-Byronic? Well, let me tell you the plot, and then we'll see. So the plot is about a young man called Aubrey who moves to London, enters society, and meets Lord Rithen. Now, he's really fascinated by Lord Rithen, who's a pretty mysterious guy. He is warned about him, but doesn't listen. And when he travels to Europe, he asks Lord Rithen to go with him. But as he journeys around Europe with him, he becomes increasingly suspicious of Lord Rithen and his morals. We see Lord Rithen constantly engaging in the seduction, particularly of the innocent and the virtuous. We also see him really invested in people's ruin, both financial, as he ruins people through gambling, and spiritual. One of the ways in which he ruins people spiritually is by, as Aubrey notes, always giving money only to the most dissolute rogues. Now, Aubrey and he split up. They part ways after Aubrey gets in Rithen's way, or in the way of one of Rithen's plans to ruin a young lady and her reputation. But they are bound to meet again, of course. Aubrey goes to Greece and there meets Ianthe, falls in love. And she warns him. She tells him, don't go out at night. But he's not going to listen to that, is he? So he goes out and she goes out after him to try and bring him back after he doesn't return until very late. And so as he's returning, he hears a sound of a struggle, and she never reaches him. She never gets there. He hears the struggle, he goes towards the sound, and he finds a poor Ianthe being sucked dry with a terrible creature hovering over her. And as any good Gothic hero would do, he faints. Now it just so happens, or what a coinkydink, that Lord Rithen is in the neighbourhood and he sort of nurses him back to health. So Aubrey starts to feel indebted to Lord Rithen and they begin to travel together again. Now there's an altercation with some mountain bandits in which Lord Rithen is mortally injured. And as he's on his deathbed, he leaves very specific instructions on what to do with his body and also promises Aubrey to secrecy for a year, that Aubrey cannot tell anybody that Rithen has died. And Aubrey's like, yes, of course, sure, no probs. He doesn't think anything of it. But of course, when he returns to London, he realises this is actually a massive problem because he sees Lord Rithen at a ball. But Lord Rithen is meant to be dead. Anyway, the inability to tell anybody this terrible secret starts to send him mad and he's eventually confined to his room. Towards the end of the year, he starts to return back to clarity, but learns that his sister's about to get married. At first, he's overjoyed, but... I mean, can you guess who she's about to marry? Fairly obviously, it's Lord Rithen. But there's nothing he can do about it because everybody thinks he's mad. So it ends pretty tragically, death all round. But why am I talking about this as an anti-Byronic narrative? Well, the Lord Rithen character is quite clearly meant to be a Byronic figure. The name of Lord Rithen was also used by Charlotte Lamb in her novel Glenarvan, whose villain was a sort of thinly disguised Byron. So we have this figure being set up as a Byronic figure, and we also have this idea that he's not actually sort of mysterious and fascinating, interesting, but underneath that is dissolute, vice-ridden, parasitic, and predatory. So we have this sort of peeling back of the mystique of the Byronic hero, or the Byronic anti-hero. This is an important text. Why? It's not the first short story featuring a vampire. It's not the first vampire in British literature, but it is one of the most influential because it's the first where we really see this aristocratic vampire, which would become so important in the vampire imaginary. Now, giving you some reading recommendations, I'd recommend reading about some of these other vampires from that early British Gothic period. Now, the vampire craze occurred in Britain in the sort of early to mid 18th century, with the news of the Arnold Paul case finally reaching England. And we don't really see any vampire literature until the end of the 18th century, in England at least. In Germany, it's a different case. We can find texts such as the, I think it's 1747 or 1748 poem De Vampyre by Henrik Ossenfelder. We're also finding texts like The Bride of Corinth by Goethe. But in Britain, we don't really get it till right at the end of the century. And the vampire at first is really based on these folkloric accounts predominantly, and is usually kind of playing a bit part in a longer work, as we find in the Giaour by Byron or in To Love the Destroyer by Robert Southey. We're also finding quite frequently female vampires, such as the vampire in To Love the Destroyer or in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Christabel, where the vampiric Geraldine appears, and obviously as well one of the most famous early lesbian vampires. We do have other short stories that predate Polidori, but not British short stories. One I definitely recommend is the tale Wake Not the Dead by Ernst Raupak, with the amazing vampiric woman Brunhilde. What we have in Britain is sort of mostly poetry, mostly women. Pre the Vampire by Polidori, the first sort of main role played by a male vampire is found in John Stagg's The Vampire from 1810. And that if you read only one of the texts that I'm talking about, I definitely recommend the John Stagg poem. And I'll pop a link to it as well in the bio. So I hope you enjoy this extra reading. I hope you've enjoyed this quick introduction to Polidori's tale. And keep reading, and do send me your other recommendations for early vampire texts from Britain or from other countries. I'd be very interested. Bye!